It was a chilly autumn morning when Margaret Thompson pushed open the heavy glass doors of First National Bank. The familiar scent of coffee from the complimentary beverage station mixed with the sterile air conditioning as she stepped inside, her worn leather purse clutched tightly against her beige cardigan. At 78, every trip to the bank had become a small adventure, but today's visit was especially important. The lobby buzzed with the usual Monday morning crowd, young professionals checking their phones impatiently, middle-aged parents herding children who'd rather be anywhere else, and fellow retirees who, like Margaret, preferred handling their banking in person rather than through those confusing apps her grandchildren kept recommending. Margaret took her place in line, carefully holding the manila envelope containing her late husband Robert's documents. After 52 years of marriage, dealing with his accounts still brought a lump to her throat. She'd taught third-grade mathematics for 35 years, but these banking procedures made her feel like a confused student all over again. The line moved slowly, giving Margaret plenty of time to rehearse what she needed to say. She watched as the young teller behind counter 3 barely looked up from her phone between customers, her long nails tapping away at the screen whenever there was a moment's break. The girl couldn't have been much older than Margaret's youngest granddaughter, Jenny. "Next in line, please," the teller called out, her voice carrying a hint of boredom. Margaret realized it was her turn and carefully made her way to the counter, her arthritis making each step deliberate. The nameplate on the counter read Jessica, though the teller seemed more interested in finishing whatever she was typing on her phone than making eye contact. "Good morning," Margaret said warmly, placing her envelope on the counter. "I need some help with my husband's account. You see, he passed away 3 months ago, and there seems to be some confusion with the—" "IT, please," Jessica interrupted, finally putting down her phone, but maintaining an expression that suggested Margaret was personally responsible for ruining her morning. The elderly woman's hands trembled slightly as she opened her purse, searching for her driver's license. "Oh dear, it's in here somewhere," Margaret mumbled, her cheeks flushing as she heard impatient sighs from the growing line behind her. Her fingers brushed past her reading glasses, grocery receipts, and the peppermints she always carried for her great-grandchildren. "Ma'am, there's a line forming," Jessica announced loudly, drumming her fingers on the counter. The sound made Margaret's hands shake even more, causing her to accidentally drop her purse. The contents spilled across the floor, lipstick, coins, and personal items scattering in every direction. A few younger customers snickered, while others pretended not to notice. Margaret's eyes welled with tears as she slowly bent to gather her belongings, her joints protesting every movement. The cold marble floor seemed to mock her dignity as she reached for each fallen item. "I can't spend all day waiting," Jessica declared to no one in particular, her voice carrying across the lobby. "Maybe you should bring someone with you next time to help." The suggestion, though perhaps well-intentioned, came out as a condescending jab that made Margaret's chest tighten with humiliation. Just as Margaret was about to give up and leave, choosing to preserve what little dignity she had left, the automatic doors whooshed open. The sound of expensive shoes clicking against marble floors filled the suddenly quiet lobby. Nobody could have predicted how this ordinary Monday morning was about to transform into something extraordinary, least of all Margaret Thompson, who was still on her knees picking up scattered peppermints. The humiliation seemed to hang in the air like a heavy fog as Margaret continued gathering her belongings from the cold marble floor. A kind-looking gentleman in his 60s stepped forward to help, but Jessica's sharp voice cut through the air. "Sir, please stay in line. We have security protocols to follow." The man stepped back reluctantly, his face showing a mix of concern and disappointment. Margaret's fingers brushed against a faded photograph that had fallen from her wallet, a picture of her and Robert on their 50th anniversary. 2 years ago, they'd celebrated at their favorite diner, Robert insisting on dancing to their song despite his bad knee. Now here she was, alone, trying to sort out the paperwork he'd always handled. "Ma'am, you're holding up the entire line," Jessica announced, her voice dripping with fake sweetness that made the situation even worse. "Perhaps you should step aside and organize your things first." A few customers shifted uncomfortably, while others typed away on their phones, probably sharing the scene on social media. Margaret's hands trembled more visibly now as she finally managed to retrieve her driver's license. The plastic card shook between her fingers as she placed it on the counter. Jessica picked it up with two perfectly manicured fingers as if it might be contaminated. "This expires next month," Jessica pointed out unnecessarily loud, causing several heads to turn. "You'll need to get it renewed. I hope you're still okay to drive." The question hung in the air like a public accusation, making Margaret's cheeks burn even hotter. Behind her, someone whispered, "My grandmother stopped driving years ago. Some people just don't know when to quit." The words weren't meant for her ears, but they cut deep all the same. Margaret had always prided herself on her independence. She still volunteered at the library twice a week and baked cookies for her great-grandchildren every Sunday. "Now, about your husband's account," Jessica sighed, clicking her mouse with obvious irritation. "It says here there's a hold on all transactions due to—" She paused dramatically, raising her voice, "irregular activity." The way she said it made it sound like an accusation of fraud rather than the simple computer error Margaret had been trying to explain. The screen of Jessica's computer reflected in her designer glasses as she scrolled, her expression suggesting she'd rather be anywhere else. "There are protocols for deceased account holders, you know. You can't just walk in here and expect to access the account without proper documentation." Margaret tried to explain again, her voice barely above a whisper now. "I have all the papers right here. The death certificate, the probate court documents, everything the other branch told me to bring." Her fingers fumbled with the manila envelope, causing several papers to scatter across the counter. Jessica made no move to help collect the documents, instead watching with visible disdain as Margaret struggled to gather them. "These need to be properly organized and submitted in triplicate," she declared, pushing the papers back across the counter without even looking at them. "And they need to be notarized within the last 30 days. A young mother in line, bouncing a fussy baby on her hip, checked her watch and groaned audibly. Jessica seized the opportunity to further embarrass Margaret. "As you can see, ma'am, we have many customers waiting. Perhaps you should come back another day when you're better prepared." The suggestion that she was somehow unprepared, after spending hours organizing these documents, felt like a slap in the face. Margaret had worked up the courage to come here alone, something she hadn't done since Robert's passing. Each visit to places they used to go together felt like reopening a wound, but she was trying her best to keep going. Tears threatened to spill from her eyes as she clutched her envelope close to her chest. The room seemed to spin slightly, and the morning's coffee churned uncomfortably in her stomach. Just as she was about to admit defeat and leave, the bank's glass doors slid open with a soft whoosh. The sudden silence that fell over the lobby was almost supernatural. Even Jessica's rapid typing ceased mid-keystroke. Margaret, still fighting back tears, turned slowly to see what had caused such a dramatic change in atmosphere. The sight that greeted her would have been unbelievable if she wasn't witnessing it with her own eyes. Through the bank's floor-to-ceiling windows, everyone could see a sleek black Tesla Model S pulling up to the curb. The car's falcon-wing doors opened smoothly, drawing gasps from those nearby. A young boy pressed his face against the glass, fog forming around his open-mouthed amazement. His mother quickly pulled him back, straightening his collar while trying to appear nonchalant. The bank's security guard, who had been dozing in his chair, suddenly sat up straight, adjusting his tie with nervous fingers. The morning sun caught the car's polished surface, sending sparkles of light dancing across the lobby walls. Even the usually disinterested Jessica had stopped scrolling through her phone, her perfectly manicured nails frozen mid-tap. When Elon Musk stepped out of the Tesla, the atmosphere in the bank shifted dramatically. He was dressed casually in a black t-shirt and jeans, looking more like someone who might fix your computer than a billionaire who could buy the entire bank chain without blinking. His presence seemed to fill the space effortlessly, though he hadn't said a word yet. A young banker in an ill-fitting suit nearly tripped over his own feet as he rushed to open the door. The automatic sensor beat him to it, leaving him awkwardly holding his hand out to empty air. Musk gave him a friendly nod anyway, causing the young man's face to flush red with excitement. The clicking of phone cameras filled the air as customers tried to discreetly capture the moment. A teenager in the back of the line whispered loudly to her friend, "Oh my God, is that really him? I thought he'd be taller." Her friend shushed her, but couldn't hide her own starstruck expression. Margaret, still clutching her scattered papers, hadn't even noticed the commotion at first. She was too busy trying to wipe away her tears with a tissue she'd found at the bottom of her purse. It wasn't until she heard Jessica's sharp intake of breath that she looked up to see what was happening. Musk paused just inside the entrance, taking in the scene before him. His eyes moved from the long line of customers to the tellers behind their counters, then settled on Margaret's hunched figure. Something in his expression changed when he noticed her tears and trembling hands. The bank manager's office door flew open so quickly it bounced against the wall. He emerged straightening his tie, his usual confident stride now more of an eager scramble. "Mr. Musk, what an unexpected honor." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, betraying his nervousness. But Musk didn't acknowledge the manager. Instead, he walked directly toward Margaret, his steps measured and purposeful. The crowd of customers parted like the Red Sea, phones still recording every moment. Jessica's face had gone from pale to ghostly white as she realized who might have witnessed her behavior. "Ma'am," Musk's voice was surprisingly gentle as he approached Margaret. "Would you mind if I asked what's troubling you?" The simple question, delivered with such genuine concern, caused fresh tears to well up in Margaret's eyes. A young woman who had been recording the scene on her phone slowly lowered it, looking ashamed. The baby that had been crying earlier fell silent, as if even it understood the significance of the moment. The only sound was the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant beeping of a car alarm somewhere outside. Margaret looked up at him, clutching her tissue. I'm just trying to sort out my late husband's account," she managed to say. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the complete silence of the lobby, everyone heard it. Musk nodded thoughtfully, then turned to look at Jessica's nameplate. The teller seemed to shrink under his gaze, her earlier confidence evaporating like morning dew. The phone she had been so attached to lay forgotten on her counter, screen dark. "Sometimes," Musk said, his voice carrying clearly across the lobby, "we forget that behind every transaction there's a human story." He gestured toward one of the leather chairs in the waiting area. "Would you mind telling me yours, Mrs. Thompson?" Margaret supplied, her voice steadier now. "Margaret Thompson." The bank manager had finally made his way through the crowd, practically bouncing on his toes with nervous energy. But before he could launch into what was surely a prepared speech, Musk held up a hand to silence him. The manager's mouth snapped shut so quickly you could hear his teeth click. The morning sun streaming through the windows caught the silver in Margaret's hair, creating a sort of halo effect. As she looked up at the man who had stopped everything to help her, she saw something in his eyes that she recognized. The same look her third-grade students used to get when they finally understood a difficult math problem. It was the look of someone who knew exactly how to make things right. The leather chair creaked softly as Margaret settled into it, her hands still clutching the manila envelope of documents. Elon Musk pulled up another chair beside her, turning it to face her directly. The simple act of him sitting down seemed to break the spell of silence that had fallen over the bank lobby. "Tell me what happened here today, Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that surprised everyone watching. The bank manager hovered nearby, shifting his weight from foot to foot like a nervous penguin. Jessica had become suddenly fascinated with reorganizing her counter, though her hands were shaking slightly. Margaret took a deep breath, smoothing her cardigan with trembling fingers. "It's about my Robert's account," she began, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. "He always handled the banking, you see. For 52 years, he took care of everything. But now," she paused, dabbing at her eyes with the tissue. Musk listened intently, nodding occasionally. When Margaret mentioned how she'd spent 3 weeks gathering all the required documents, he picked up one of the scattered papers from her envelope. His eyes narrowed as he scanned it, then looked up at the bank manager. "These documents are in perfect order," he stated flatly. "Death certificate, probate papers, everything needed to process this transition. Why wasn't this handled properly?" The question hung in the air like thunder before a storm. The manager's face had turned the color of old porridge. "Well, you see, Mr. Musk, there are certain protocols, procedures that need to be followed." His voice trailed off as Musk raised an eyebrow. "Protocols?" Musk repeated, glancing at Jessica's counter where the teller was still pretending to be invisible. "Do these protocols include making a grieving widow feel embarrassed for asking for help? Is public humiliation part of your customer service training?" A young man in line whispered "ouch" under his breath, earning sharp looks from those around him. The baby that had been quiet earlier let out a happy gurgle, as if appreciating the drama unfolding before it. Margaret watched in amazement as Elon Musk, the man she'd only seen on television and in newspaper headlines, began methodically organizing her scattered papers. His fingers moved with the same precision she imagined he used when designing rockets or electric cars. Mrs. Thompson taught third-grade mathematics for 35 years, Musk announced to the lobby at large, causing Margaret to look up in surprise. She hadn't mentioned that detail yet. "I did a little research while walking over here," he explained with a slight smile. "That's 35 years of shaping young minds, teaching future engineers, doctors, and yes, even bankers." His gaze swept meaningfully across the staff. The security guard, who had been watching everything with wide eyes, suddenly straightened his uniform and walked over. "Mrs. Thompson," he said softly, "you helped my daughter overcome her fear of math back in 1992. She's an accountant now." His revelation caused Margaret's eyes to fill with fresh tears, but this time they were tears of recognition and joy. Musk stood up, his casual black t-shirt and jeans somehow looking more professional than the manager's expensive suit. "Here's what's going to happen," he announced, his voice carrying that same quiet authority that had built multiple billion-dollar companies. "Mrs. Thompson's account issues will be resolved today. Not tomorrow, not next week. Today." The manager nodded so vigorously his glasses slipped down his nose. "Of course, Mr. Musk. I'll handle it personally." He fumbled with his keycard, nearly dropping it in his haste to unlock his office door. But Musk wasn't finished. And, he continued, "We're going to have a conversation about customer service training. Real training, not just protocols and procedures." His eyes found Jessica, who had finally run out of things to pretend to organize. Sometimes the most important qualification isn't how fast you can process a transaction, but how well you can listen to someone's story. The customers in line had long forgotten their own banking needs, completely absorbed in the scene playing out before them. A few were nodding in agreement, while others looked thoughtfully at their own elderly parents' photos in their phones. Margaret watched as this powerful man, who could have been anywhere in the world that morning, took the time to not only help her, but to make sure no one else would face the same treatment. She thought about what Robert would have said, how his eyes would have twinkled with appreciation for this unexpected act of kindness. The morning sun had risen higher now, its rays catching the Tesla's chrome trim through the windows and sending another dance of light across the lobby. But the real brightness in the room came from the smile slowly spreading across Margaret's face as she realized that sometimes justice arrived in the most unexpected packages. Inside the bank manager's office, the atmosphere had changed completely. The leather chairs that usually intimidated visitors now held a remarkable gathering. Margaret Thompson sat with her papers neatly arranged before her, while Elon Musk leaned forward in his chair, listening intently to every word she said. The bank manager, still looking like he'd swallowed his tie, stood nervously behind his massive oak desk. "So you're telling me," Musk said slowly, his fingers tapping thoughtfully on the armrest, "that Mrs. Thompson has been trying to resolve this for 3 weeks. His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath the surface. The morning light filtering through the Venetian blinds cast stripes across his face, making him look even more formidable. The manager's forehead glistened with sweat as he shuffled through papers on his desk. "There were complications with the system," he stammered, looking anywhere but at Musk's steady gaze. "Our new computer upgrade sometimes flags certain accounts for additional security measures." "Computers," Musk said, a hint of irony in his voice. "I know a thing or two about those." A few chuckles could be heard from the customers still watching through the office's glass walls. "But tell me, does your computer system require your tellers to mock elderly customers? Is that part of the upgrade?" Margaret sat straighter in her chair, her dignity returning with each passing moment. The tissue she'd been clutching lay forgotten in her lap as she watched this unexpected champion fight her battle. Through the office windows, she could see Jessica still at her counter, but the young teller's earlier arrogance had been replaced with something that looked very much like regret. "Of course not, Mr. Musk." The manager's voice cracked slightly. "We pride ourselves on customer service. This situation is unusual." He reached for a glass of water on his desk, nearly knocking it over in his nervousness. Unusual. Musk leaned back in his chair, his casual t-shirt somehow looking more authoritative than the manager's expensive suit. What's unusual is finding a woman who spent 3.5 decades teaching future generations being treated like she's inconveniencing everyone by asking for help. Outside the office, the regular bank operations had ground to a halt. Customers who had been impatiently checking their watches earlier now stood in small groups, discussing what they'd witnessed. The young mother with the baby had taken a seat, quietly explaining to her child why this moment mattered. When I started my first company, Musk continued, his voice carrying clearly through the office, I had a teacher just like Mrs. Thompson. She believed in me when others didn't. She took the time to explain things I didn't understand, never making me feel small for asking questions. He paused, letting his words sink in. That's the kind of service your bank should be providing. The manager nodded so vigorously his glasses slipped down his nose again. Yes, absolutely, Mr. Musk. We'll implement new training procedures immediately. Cultural sensitivity workshops, customer service seminars. No, Musk interrupted firmly. Not workshops, not seminars, real change. He turned to Margaret, his expression softening. Mrs. Thompson, would you be willing to help this bank understand what real customer service looks like? Share your experience as a teacher. Margaret's eyes widened in surprise. Me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Who better? Musk smiled. You spent 35 years teaching children how to overcome their fears of mathematics. Surely you can teach a few bankers how to treat people with dignity. The security guard, who had been standing by the door, suddenly spoke up. Mrs. Thompson helped my daughter understand fractions when everyone else had given up. She stayed after school for weeks until it finally clicked. His voice carried pride and gratitude. Through the glass walls, several other customers nodded in recognition. It seemed Margaret had touched more lives than she realized. An older gentleman in line raised his hand slightly. She taught my son too, he called out. He's an engineer now. The manager, sensing the shifting winds, straightened his tie and cleared his throat. Mrs. Thompson, he said, his voice now carrying genuine respect, would you consider being a consultant for our customer service department? We could certainly benefit from your experience. Musk watched as Margaret's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of joy and validation. The same hands that had trembled while picking up scattered papers now rested calmly in her lap. She looked around the office at the faces watching expectantly through the glass, at Jessica who could barely meet her eyes, and at Elon Musk who had turned an ordinary Monday morning into something extraordinary. Well, she said, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth, I suppose I do have some free time now that I'm retired. And teaching is teaching, whether it's fractions or kindness. The simple wisdom in her words made even Musk nod in appreciation. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, its rays now streaming directly through the office windows, illuminating the scene like a spotlight on a stage. In that moment, everyone present understood they were witnessing not just justice being served, but a powerful reminder that every person, regardless of age or circumstance, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. The next hour in the bank unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony of redemption. Elon Musk didn't just ensure Margaret's banking issues were resolved, he turned the whole experience into a masterclass in human dignity. The large conference room, usually reserved for board meetings, now hosted an impromptu gathering that would change the bank's culture forever. Margaret sat at the head of the conference table, her initial nervousness replaced by the confident posture of someone who had spent decades commanding classrooms. Beside her, Musk had rolled up his sleeves, literally and figuratively, as they worked through not just her account issues, but a complete overhaul of the bank's customer service approach. You see, Margaret explained, her teacher's voice naturally emerging, when a student, or in this case, a customer, comes to you struggling, they're not just bringing you a problem. They're bringing you their trust. She looked around the room, making eye contact with each staff member, including Jessica, who sat in the back corner, her phone nowhere in sight. The bank manager, who had initially been focused solely on damage control, found himself taking notes with genuine interest. Mrs. Thompson, he said, could you tell us more about how you handled difficult situations in your classroom? Perhaps there are parallels we could draw. Margaret smiled, reaching into her purse and pulling out a small worn notebook. "I've kept this for 35 years, she said, her fingers gently caressing the cover. "Every time a student overcame a challenge, I wrote down what worked. Sometimes it was patience, sometimes it was finding a new way to explain things, but it was always about treating them with respect." Musk leaned forward, genuinely intrigued. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the notebook. As he flipped through the pages, his expression softened. "This is remarkable. You've basically created a manual for human connection." The security guard, still standing by the door, shared his own story. "I remember when my daughter was struggling with math. Mrs. Thompson didn't just teach her numbers, she taught her confidence. She'd say, sometimes the hardest part of solving a problem is believing you can." Outside the conference room, customers continued their banking, but the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The tellers, having observed the morning's events, were taking extra time with each person, especially the elderly ones. One teller even pulled up a chair for an older gentleman who was having trouble standing. "You know," Musk said, addressing the room, "when I was building my companies, everyone focused on the technology. But the real breakthrough was always in how we treated people." He turned to Margaret. "Mrs. Thompson, would you be willing to share some of these strategies from your notebook? I think they could help not just this bank, but many other businesses." Margaret's eyes widened. "These are just simple observations," she said modestly, but Musk shook his head. "Simple doesn't mean unimportant. Sometimes the simplest solutions are the most powerful." He picked up one of her notes and read aloud. "When someone's hands are shaking, steady them with your patience. That's not just about teaching math, that's about human dignity." The manager, who had been quietly typing on his laptop, looked up. "Mrs. Thompson, we'd like to offer you a permanent position as our customer experience consultant. Your insights could help us transform not just this branch, but our entire banking network." Jessica, who had been silent throughout the meeting, finally spoke up from her corner. "Mrs. Thompson," her voice wavered slightly, "I owe you an apology. I forgot that behind every transaction, there's a person with a story." Her words, though simple, carried genuine remorse. Margaret studied the young teller's face for a moment before responding. "Dear, in my 35 years of teaching, the students who struggled the most often became the best teachers themselves. Sometimes we need to learn our hardest lessons to become our best selves." Musk nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of wisdom we need more of in the business world." He turned to his assistant, who had been quietly taking notes. "Make sure Mrs. Thompson's teaching methods are incorporated into the customer service training programs for all my companies." The morning sun had climbed high enough now to flood the conference room with warm light. Margaret's silver hair seemed to glow as she opened her notebook again, ready to share more of her lifetime of wisdom. The room fell silent, bankers and billionaire alike, as they prepared to learn from a teacher who had never really retired, but had just found a new classroom. 1 month later, the First National Bank had transformed in ways nobody could have predicted. The story of Margaret Thompson and Elon Musk's intervention had spread far beyond the local community, touching hearts and changing lives across the country. The security camera's footage of that memorable morning had gone viral, garnering millions of views and sparking a national conversation about how we treat our elderly. The bank's lobby, once cold and intimidating, now felt warm and welcoming. Comfortable chairs had been added to every teller station, and a cozy reading nook occupied the corner where people could wait their turn in comfort. But the biggest change wasn't in the furniture, it was in the people. Margaret arrived for her regular Tuesday morning consultation, wearing her favorite blue cardigan and carrying her trusty notebook. The same doors that had once witnessed her humiliation now opened to greet a respected advisor whose wisdom was changing corporate culture one lesson at a time. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson," called the security guard, who now kept a small bowl of peppermints on his desk, a trick he'd learned from Margaret about making people feel at home. His daughter, the accountant, had recently started volunteering to teach basic financial literacy at the local senior center. Jessica, who had undergone the most remarkable transformation, stood from behind her counter and walked around to greet Margaret properly. Gone was the phone-obsessed teller who had caused such pain. In her place stood a young woman who had learned the value of kindness and respect. "We're ready for today's session," Jessica said warmly. The new trainees are especially excited to hear about your teaching methods. Her name tag now proudly displayed Senior Customer Care Specialist, a promotion she'd earned through dedicated effort to change. The conference room, now officially renamed the Thompson Room, was filled with faces both familiar and new. Bank employees from other branches had traveled to learn from the former school teacher who was revolutionizing customer service. On the wall hung a beautifully framed quote from Margaret's notebook: "Every number has a story, and every story deserves to be heard." Today, Margaret began, her teacher's voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. "We're going to talk about something that wasn't in any of my math lessons, but was in every single one of them: dignity." She opened her notebook, its pages now supplemented with new observations from her banking experiences. The regional director, who had flown in specifically for this session, leaned forward in his chair. The bank's customer satisfaction ratings had soared in the past month, and word was spreading through the financial industry about the Thompson method of customer service. Outside the conference room, the daily banking operations continued, but with a noticeably different atmosphere. Tellers took time to really listen to their customers, especially the elderly ones. The young mother who had witnessed everything a month ago was now a regular visitor, bringing her baby who had become something of a mascot for the bank's new approach. Margaret's phone buzzed quietly. A text message from Elon Musk himself. He had kept in touch, occasionally sending updates about how her teaching principles were being implemented across his companies. The previous week, he had quoted her in a global business conference: "The future of technology isn't just about innovation, it's about human connection." The bank manager, who had once been focused solely on procedures and protocols, now started each morning by reading a page from what they called Margaret's Manual, the collected wisdom from her teaching notebook, professionally bound and distributed to every branch in the network. An elderly gentleman at Jessica's counter was struggling with his deposit slip. Instead of showing impatience, she smiled warmly and said, "Take your time, sir. Would you like a peppermint while we work on this together?" The man's grateful smile proved that the smallest gestures often carried the greatest impact. The story had inspired other businesses too. Local shops had started training their staff in the Thompson method, and a nearby college had invited Margaret to give a guest lecture on customer service ethics. Her simple wisdom, treating every person with dignity and respect, was creating ripples that reached far beyond that one dramatic morning. As Margaret looked around the room at the eager faces waiting to learn from her, she thought about Robert. He would have loved seeing this, she knew. His practical approach to banking had always been mixed with genuine care for people. In a way, she was carrying on his legacy while creating her own. The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching the silver in Margaret's hair just as it had done that fateful day. But now, instead of illuminating tears of humiliation, it highlighted the quiet pride of someone who had turned a moment of pain into a movement of positive change. Her story had become more than just a viral video or a corporate success. It had become a reminder that sometimes life's hardest moments can lead to its most beautiful transformations.